Ever feel like you're on autopilot, you're just lost in your thoughts, and your mind is just chatting away to who exactly? Welcome viewers to the Quantum Soul channel, where today's deep dive tackles that very question: who is the mind talking to? We'll be unpacking some pretty intriguing ideas from our source material about the illusion of self, that inner monologue we all experience, and what might lie beyond it.
It's a deceptively simple question, but it can really unravel some profound truths about our experience of reality. We so readily buy into the idea that I am this voice in my head, this collection of thoughts and feelings. But the source material really challenges us to consider, what if that's just a story, a construct, and there's a deeper dimension to who we are?
That's what really grabbed me too. This source uses a powerful analogy of the mind as a mirror, but it got me thinking, how distorted is our individual mirror? Are we even seeing ourselves clearly?
That's a great point to raise. The mind, as this source describes it, is constantly reflecting back to us a limited, filtered version of reality. It takes this stream of experiences, sensations, thoughts, emotions, and tries to weave them into this coherent narrative, a sense of me. But is that narrative the whole picture or just a convenient fiction?
And that's where the question of the audience comes in. If the me is just a construct, who is the mind performing for with this constant inner chatter, the source suggests, intriguingly, that there's no one listening at all?
Precisely. Imagine a stage with actors delivering their lines, but the theater is completely empty. It's this self-perpetuating dialogue, the mind essentially talking to itself, creating this illusion of a separate I thought that then generates even more thoughts in response.
That's wild. It's like realizing the Wizard of Oz is just a guy behind a curtain pulling levers. But if there's no audience, no me freely listening, what's the point of all this mental chatter?
Here's where things get really interesting. The source points to a fundamental experience we all have, a sense of I am. That exists prior to any thoughts or feelings. It's the raw awareness as being, the bedrock upon which the mind then builds its elaborate constructs.
So this I am is like the raw material, the clay, and the mind is the sculptor shaping it into this limited sense of self.
That's a great way to visualize it. The mind takes this pure awareness and tries to define it, contain it, and turn it into a separate self with boundaries and limitations. It latches onto things like our body, thoughts, emotions, and possessions, saying, this is me.
So we go from this expansive sense of simply being present to this contracted, defined me trapped in the mind's narrative.
Exactly. And the irony is that the mind, this limited tool, can never truly grasp the vastness of pure awareness, because awareness is what allows the mind to exist in the first place. It's like a wave trying to understand the ocean.
Okay, viewers, if this is resonating with you, if you're feeling that spark of insight, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Let's spread the exploration of the quantum soul far and wide. Now back to our deep dive. If this I am feeling is so fundamental, is it something we can actually experience, or is it just an abstract concept?
It's definitely something you can experience directly. It's not some esoteric state you have to achieve through years of meditation. It's already here, right now. Let's try a little experiment. Close your eyes for a moment and just be aware of yourself, of your existence. Notice the feeling of I am before any thoughts or labels come in. That pure presence. That's the ground of being.
Wow, that's actually quite powerful. It's like a stillness beneath the surface of all the mental activity. But if this awareness is always present, why do we get so caught up in the mind's illusion?
It's in the nature of the mind to create, to interpret, to categorize. It's constantly seeking to make sense of the world, to find patterns and connections. But in doing so, it creates a kind of veil between us and the direct experience of reality.
It's like looking at the world through a filter, or maybe those old 3D glasses where everything looks a little distorted. But if we can become aware of the filter, can we start to see things more clearly?
Absolutely. By recognizing that the me story is just a construct, we can start to disentangle ourselves from its limitations. The source uses a really interesting analogy to illustrate this point.
I'm all ears.
Imagine you're watching a movie. You get completely absorbed in the story, the characters, the emotions. You laugh, you cry, you cheer. But then at some point, you remember that you're actually sitting in a theater watching a movie. You become aware of the screen, the projector, the other people around you. That shift in perspective, that's the witness waking up.
That's a great analogy. It's like suddenly becoming aware that you're not the characters in the movie, but the observer, the one who's had the experience. So how do we apply that to our everyday lives? How do we become more aware of the witness within?
The key is to cultivate a sense of detachment in the mind's chatter. Instead of getting caught up in every thought, feeling, and sensation, we can practice observing of curiosity and detachment.
So it's not about trying to silence the mind completely, but rather changing our relationship to it. Instead of being swept away by the current, we become more like a surfer riding the waves.
That's a great way to put it. And the more we practice this, the more we realize that we're not our thoughts, feelings, or even our physical body. We're the awareness that's experiencing all of it.
That's a pretty radical shift in perspective. But if we're not the thinker of our thoughts, who is? If we're not the feeler of our feelings, who is?
That's a question that has puzzled philosophers and spiritual seekers for centuries. The Source doesn't offer a definitive answer, but it does suggest that the sense of a separate self, a doer behind our actions, is ultimately an illusion.
So it's not that there's some other entity controlling us, but rather that the very idea of a controller, a separate self, is what needs to be questioned.
Precisely. And this is where the concept of the ego comes in. The ego, according to the Source, is essentially the I that the mind creates, the persona we present to the world, the collection of stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
So the ego is like the mask we wear, the role we play.
Exactly. And like any mask, it can be helpful in certain situations. It allows us to interact with the world, to achieve goals, to protect ourselves. But the problem is that we often become so identified with the mask that we forget who we are underneath.
It's like those actors who get so caught up in their roles that they forget their own identity.
And this identification with the ego is what creates so much suffering. We get attached to our thoughts, beliefs, and desires. And when they're challenged or threatened, we experience pain and frustration.
But if we can start to see the ego for what it is, a collection of mental constructs, can we start to loosen its grip on us?
Absolutely. The Source offers a number of practices and insights that can help us to disidentify from the ego and reconnect with our true nature as pure awareness.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm eager to dive into those practices in the next part of our deep dive. But before we wrap up this segment, I want to remind our viewers to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you're finding this exploration insightful, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends.
So we've established that the mind loves to talk, but who is it talking to? Itself, it seems, and you, the listener, are not the mind or its endless chatter, but the silent witness, the awareness that observes it all.
It's such a profound realization, isn't it? That we're not these fleeting thoughts and emotions, but the spacious awareness in which they arise and fall away. But I have to admit, it's a lot easier to grasp that concept intellectually than to actually experience it in daily life.
Absolutely. It's a practice, not a destination. The source material offers some really interesting insights into how we can cultivate this awareness, this ability to witness the mind, without getting swept away by its current.
I'm ready to dive in. What kind of practices are we talking about?
Well, one of the most common practices is, of course, meditation. But it's not just about sitting on a cushion with your eyes closed. It's about bringing that same quality of awareness to every moment of your life.
So whether I'm washing dishes, walking the dog, or even having a heated debate online, I can be practicing this witnessing.
Exactly. It's about noticing the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that arise without getting caught up in them. Just like watching clouds passing by in the sky, you can observe the movements of the mind without judgment or attachment.
You know, I've dabbled in meditation, and I often find myself getting frustrated because my mind just won't quiet down. Is it even possible to completely silence the mind?
That's a common misconception. The goal of meditation isn't necessarily to empty the mind completely. It's more about creating space between yourself and your thought. It's about recognizing that you're not your thought. You're the observer of your thought.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of just trying to force my mind to be quiet, I can simply acknowledge the thoughts and let them pass without engaging with them.
Precisely. It's like training a puppy. At first, the puppy's mind is all over the place. It wants to chase every squirrel bark at every passerby. But with consistent training, you can teach the puppy to focus, to be calm and present. The mind is similar. It takes practice and patience, but you can train it to be more focused and less reactive.
And I love that analogy. It makes this whole process feel a lot less daunting. But I have to ask, if we're not our thoughts, who is doing the thinking?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of what this source is exploring. It's suggesting that the sense of a separate doer, an I that's in control, is ultimately an illusion.
So it's some other entity controlling our thoughts, but rather that the very idea of a controller, a separate self, is what needs to be questioned.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You turn on a light switch, the light comes on. Does that mean you created the electricity? No, you simply activated a pre-existing condition. Similarly, thoughts arise in awareness. We don't create them, but we can choose how we respond to them.
That's mind-blowing. It's like realizing the electricity was always there, we just didn't know how to access it. But if we're not the thinker of our thoughts, then what about free will? Do we have any control over our lives at all?
Another great question. The source material doesn't deny the existence of free will, but it suggests that our understanding of it may be limited. It's not about controlling every thought and action, but rather about becoming more aware of the underlying patterns and conditioning that shape our choices.
So it's more about making conscious choices, rather than simply reacting to whatever thoughts pop into our heads.
Precisely. And this is where the concept of the ego comes into play. The source describes the ego as the I that the mind creates, the persona we present to the world, the collection of stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
Okay, so the ego is like the mask we wear, the role we play in the world.
Exactly. And like any mask, it can be helpful in certain situations. It allows us to interact with the world to achieve goals to protect ourselves. But the problem is that we often become so identified with the mask that we forget who we are underneath. We start to believe that the mask is the real us.
So it's like those actors who get so caught up in their roles that they forget their own identities off stage. They start to believe they are the character they're portraying.
It's a perfect analogy. And this identification with the ego is what creates so much suffering. We get attached to our thoughts, beliefs, and desires. And when they're challenged or threatened, we experience pain and frustration.
It's like building our entire identity on a foundation of sand. When the tides change, everything comes crashing down.
Exactly. And the source suggests that true freedom comes from recognizing that we are not the ego, we are not the mask, we are the awareness that's experiencing it all.
So it's about disentangling ourselves from the ego's grip, from the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, and reconnecting with that pure awareness that's always present.
Precisely. And that's where the real journey of self-discovery begins. The source material offers some fascinating insights and practices that can help us to do just that.
You know, viewers, this conversation is really starting to resonate with me. If you're feeling the same way, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Let's spread this exploration of the quantum soul far and wide. Now back to our deep dive. I'm eager to hear more about these practices for disidentifying from the ego. What can we actually do to start loosening its grip on our lives?
Well, one of the most powerful practices is simply to become aware of the ego's games. The ego is a master of deception. It's constantly trying to convince us that its thoughts and desires are our own, that its fears and insecurities are real. But the more we can observe these patterns, the less power they have over us.
So it's like shining a light on a shadow. Once we see it for what it is, it loses its ability to scare us.
Exactly. The ego thrives in darkness, in the unconscious realm, but when we bring awareness to its machinations, it starts to dissolve.
Can you give me an example of what these ego games might look like in everyday life?
Absolutely. Let's say you're at work and a colleague receives praise for a project that you also worked on. The ego might immediately jump in with thoughts like, that's not fair, I did most of the work. Or, they're always getting the recognition and I'm always overlooked.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well. My inner critic can be quite vocal at times.
We all have that inner critic. It's part of the human condition. But the key is to recognize that these thoughts are just the ego's way of trying to protect itself, to maintain its sense of self-importance.
So instead of getting swept away by those feelings of resentment or inadequacy, I can simply observe them and recognize that they're not necessarily true.
Exactly. You can say to yourself, there's the ego again trying to stir up some drama. By simply acknowledging the ego's presence, you create space between yourself and those thoughts. You don't have to believe them or act on them.
That's incredibly empowering. It's like realizing that I have a choice in how I respond to those thoughts. But what about when the ego's fears and insecurities feel very real and overwhelming?
That's where practices like mindfulness and self-compassion can be incredibly helpful. Mindfulness is about bringing your attention to the present moment, to your breath, to your body, to the sensations you're experiencing. It's about noticing those fears and insecurities without judgment, with a sense of kindness and curiosity.
So instead of trying to push those feelings away or pretend they don't exist, I can simply allow them to be present without getting lost in them.
Exactly. And self-compassion is about extending that same kindness and understanding to yourself that you would offer to a loved one who is struggling. It's about recognizing that you're not perfect, that you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to experience difficult emotions. And it's about offering yourself love and support in those moments.
That's such a powerful reminder. I think we often forget to be kind to ourselves, especially when we're feeling down or insecure.
Absolutely. We can be so hard on ourselves, holding ourselves to impossible standards, but the more we can practice self-compassion, the more we create space for healing and growth.
You know, this whole conversation about the ego and its games reminds me of the ancient Greek myth of Narcissus. Narcissus was so enamored with his own reflection that he couldn't see anything else. He became trapped in his own self-image, unable to connect with the world around him.
That's a wonderful analogy. The ego can be like Narcissus, constantly seeking validation and admiration, lost in its own reflection. But true fulfillment doesn't come from feeding the ego's insatiable hunger. It comes from connecting with something larger than ourselves, from recognizing our interconnectedness with all beings.
So it's not about denying the ego or trying to eliminate it completely, but rather about seeing it for what it is and learning to work with it skillfully.
Precisely. The ego is part of the human experience. It's not inherently bad or wrong, but when it's running the show, when we're completely identified with it, it can lead to a lot of suffering.
It's like trying to drive a car with the emergency brake on. You might get somewhere eventually. It's going to be a bumpy and exhausting ride.
That's a great analogy, and the source material offers a number of practices and insights that can help us to release the emergency brake, so to speak, and allow our true nature, our pure awareness, to guide the way.
I'm really intrigued to learn more about these practices, but before we dive in, I want to remind our viewers that if you're enjoying this deep dive, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Let's continue to explore the mysteries of the quantum soul together.
Absolutely, we're just scratching the surface here, and there's so much more to uncover. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into some specific practices and techniques for disidentifying from the ego and reconnecting with our true nature as pure awareness.
Viewers, we're in the midst of our deep dive into the question, who is the mind talking to? We've uncovered some pretty fascinating insights so far.
We've explored the idea that the mind is in constant dialogue with itself, creating the illusion of a separate me, while the true self, the awareness that observes it all, remains silent and unchanging.
We've also touched on how this identification with the mind's chatter, with the ego's stories and demands, can lead to a lot of suffering, but I'm really eager to delve into the practical side of things. What can we actually do to shift our perspective and start living from that place of awareness?
That's a great question, and it's where the rubber really meets the road. The source material offers a variety of practices, but one of the most fundamental is simply cultivating mindfulness in daily life.
I've heard that term a lot, mindfulness, but to be honest, it still feels a bit vague to me. What do they actually look like in practice?
Think of it as a shift in attention, a way of becoming more present to your experience in each moment. Instead of getting lost in thoughts about the past or future, you bring your awareness to what's happening right now.
So it's about noticing the sensations in your body, the sounds around you, the taste of your food, without judgment or elaboration.
Exactly. It's about being fully present with whatever is arising, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. Instead of trying to control or change your experience, you simply allow it to be.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture. But how does mindfulness actually help us disidentify from the ego and connect with that deeper awareness?
Well, the ego thrives on distraction. It wants to keep you preoccupied with thoughts, worries, and desires. But when you bring your attention to the present moment, you create space for the ego's grip to loosen.
It's like taking the spotlight off the ego and shining it on the present moment instead.
That's a great way to put it. And the more you practice mindfulness, the more you start to notice the gap between your thought and the awareness that's observing them.
So it's not about stopping thoughts altogether, but rather about recognizing that you're not your thoughts.
Precisely. You can have thoughts without being completely consumed by them. You can observe them with a sense of detachment, almost as if they're passing clouds in the sky of your awareness.
That's such a beautiful image. I can really see how that shift in perspective could create a sense of freedom and peace. But is mindfulness something that requires hours of meditation every day?
Not at all. You can incorporate mindfulness into even the most mundane activities. While you're washing dishes, for example, you can pay attention to the feel of the water on your hands, the scent of the soap, the sound of the plates clinking.
So it's about bringing that same quality of presence to whatever I'm doing, whether it's walking the dog, having a conversation, or even just waiting in line at the grocery store.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. It's like exercising a muscle. At first, it might feel awkward or unfamiliar, but with time, it becomes easier and more effortless.
Okay, mindfulness makes a lot of sense to me. But are there other practices that can support this journey of disidentifying from the ego?
Absolutely. Another powerful practice is self-inquiry, which involves questioning the thoughts and beliefs that create the illusion of a separate self.
So instead of just accepting my thoughts at face value, I start to question them. I ask myself, is this really true? Where did this belief come from? Is it serving me?
Exactly. Self-inquiry is about shining the light of awareness on your mental and emotional patterns. It's about becoming more aware of the stories you tell yourself and the assumptions you make about yourself and the world.
I could see how that could be really transformative. It's like taking an inventory of your mental furniture and deciding what to keep, what to toss, and what needs a good dusting.
That's a great analogy. And as you start to question those limiting beliefs and negative self-talk, you create space for a new way of seeing yourself to emerge.
So it's not about suppressing thoughts or emotions, but about examining them more closely, seeing them from a different perspective.
Precisely. It's about becoming more conscious of the inner dialogue that's constantly running in the background. And as you become more aware of those patterns, you have the power to choose whether to continue believing them or to let them go.
This is fascinating stuff. And I can already feel how empowering it could be to start questioning those old limiting stories that I've been carrying around for so long.
That's the beauty of self-inquiry. It gives you the power to rewrite your own narrative, to create a new story that's more aligned with your true nature.
This whole conversation reminds me of the philosophical concept of the Socratic method, where you use questions to challenge assumptions and arrive at a deeper understanding.
That's a great connection. Self-inquiry is very much in line with that approach. It's about using questions to deconstruct the ego's illusions and reveal the truth of who you are beyond those limitations.
This is so inspiring. But I have to admit, I'm a little hesitant to start poking around in my own mind. What if I uncover something scary or unpleasant?
That's a common fear, but it's important to remember that you're not alone in this journey. We all have shadows and blind spots. The key is to approach self-inquiry with compassion and curiosity, not judgment or fear.
So it's like being a gentle archaeologist, carefully excavating the layers of my own mind with a sense of wonder and respect for what I might find.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And as you start to uncover those hidden parts of yourself, you might be surprised by the wisdom and resilience you find there.
Viewers, this conversation is really starting to open my eyes to the possibilities of living from a more conscious and aware place. If you're feeling inspired, be sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends. Let's continue to explore the mysteries of the quantum soul together.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just the beginning of the journey. The more you practice mindfulness, self-inquiry, and other practices that support awareness, the more you'll start to experience the freedom and peace that come from recognizing your true nature beyond the ego's illusions.
And viewers, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to remind you that there are 2 videos on your screen to help you continue your exploration. Click on one of them to delve even deeper into the fascinating world of consciousness and spiritual awakening. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep shining bright.